So it is a pleasure to be here. And the mayor's office with people with disabilities is working hard. Oh, I think, there we go. Hard every day to make New York City the most accessible city in the world. And when I say those things, people often laugh at me because New York City is challenging. We're an older city, and we need to make sure that we do things the right way. And the Americans with Disabilities Act keeps us grounded in that. Well, there's a bunch of things that we're working on, specifically transportation. We need to find a better way to efficiently get people with disabilities around our city in a great way. Many of you have taken the subways since you're here, and you'll notice that it's not most friendly for people with disabilities, and we get that. So we're working to figure out ways that we can incentivize developers to build elevators and next to subway stations or above subway stations. So we're working towards that. 50% of our cabs will be accessible by the year 2020. That's over 6,000 cabs. Our yellow cabs and more cabs will be accessible in the green sector as well. So that's a great way to get people around the city in an efficient way. Now, along with that, we have to make sure that people with disabilities are connected to something that is life-changing, and that is jobs. People with disabilities are generally underemployed or unemployed, and we live in poverty. And that's not good. That's not good for society as a whole. It's not good for the person with the disability or their family members. So we need to be able to rise people up. And we are working towards doing that in lots of different ways. Because if we can rise people up and get them employment, get people with disabilities employment, we're able to get them into housing. Mayor de Blasio has pushed really hard on affordable housing here in New York City. And with every affordable housing unit that comes up, they're set aside for people with disabilities. But in order for that person with a disability to get that housing, they have to rise up from poverty. They have to have income that matches the accessible affordable housing. So we have a big initiative to get people employed in New York City. But first I'm going to go through statistics and what our city looks like for people with disabilities. Working? It was. Oh, back. There we go. So if a little sensitive. So if we look at the population, bring it back. You got it? All right, great. Thank you. If you go back one more. So this is the population of people in New York. I guess you're not going to get to that slide, so I'll talk to it anyway. There are close to 1 million people with disabilities in New York City, and if we look at those statistics, they're pretty alarming. That's 11% of the population, 1 out of every 8 New Yorkers. And biggest borough of people with disabilities happens to live in Brooklyn, along with, then second is Queens, then the Bronx, Manhattan, and Staten Island. So the numbers are pretty extraordinary. And these are people that have self-disclosed on the American Community Survey. We're not even talking about the people that haven't disclosed their disabilities. So we figure it's anywhere from 1.5 million to 2 million people with disabilities that are not being registered. So the number is large, and it's a big percentage of the population. Because at some point in your life, you'll either become disabled, know someone that's disabled, or be temporarily disabled. It's just a matter of time before it affects you. Next slide, please. Now, this is the employment rate for people with disabilities. Of close to the 4 million people that are employed, only 4% of those are people with disabilities. That's 136,000 people with disabilities employed in our city. It's dismal. And if you think of the population that's out there, it just doesn't make sense. So we need to change that. Next slide, please. So we have a lot of different employment initiatives. Next. And one of the things that we're really pushing is a business development council. We know that the only way this is going to work and getting people with disabilities employed is if we have a business development council that is committed to making the change that needs to be done. They're the ones that need to take the lead. They're the ones that need to be at the table training people with disabilities, training their staff to make sure people with disabilities are represented, meaning how does a staff member work with someone that's has a disability? We hear lots of different things about hiring people with disabilities. Well, and we hear this, I think it's across the board, is where do we find the talent? Well, there's talent is out there. And we want to take that out of the equation. Next slide, please. So what we've done is we're building a pipeline that matters. We've reached out to all the colleges in the New York City area, and we have the people on our Business Development Council. And we're having these Business Development Council leaders take the lead in training people and finding out what they actually need, because people with disabilities want to hear from the businesses. They don't want, we've tried lots of different ways for employment. We used to have a one-day job shadowing day called Disability Mentoring Day, and we matched people up, and it was great, but it was only a one-day job thing. And it didn't work, and it didn't work well because the businesses weren't leading. So now we have these businesses leading. Next slide, please. We've been working with JetBlue. We started off with six interns. 3 of them got jobs right now. I know it's minuscule, but it's the way that we're going to approach this. Really doing the research at the beginning, getting the people matched up, vetting the people that are correctly, getting the businesses involved, and showing them that, you know what, a reasonable accommodation isn't as difficult as you think it is. I have people in my office that come into our office. I have a little person that works in my office. You know what his reasonable accommodation is? A stool. You know what, how much does a stool cost, right? Not much at all. So we really have to think about breaking down those barriers in our workplace. And people turn around and say, well, we have to buy a screen reader. That's going to cost us money. Yeah, you know what? It may cost you money, but what it's going to do and the productivity that you're going to get out of that person is going to be extraordinary. And there's other different ways to pay for it. So I just think that's ridiculous when I hear people say, we can't hire people with disabilities because of reasonable accommodation. Well, they're small, you have to research what it is, and you really need to be educated. Next slide. So we know the city has lots of different issues when it comes to this. I wish we could say that we do it well. And we're the bar, and you have to get there. But we're not. And we know that we need to make our websites more accessible, and we're working towards that. We have web development people on my team right now making sure that we look at ways to make all of our social media accessible. Social media is not accessible in any way, shape, or form for people with visual disabilities and people with disabilities as a whole. So we need to make sure that our websites are accessible. We need to make sure that our videos are captioned, that that every content that we put up, accessible PDFs, are there. So we're going through that exercise now, and we will become a standard later on. But what we've been doing is making sure that we hire ADA coordinators or disability service facilitators in city agencies, making sure that they're across the board, because anything that New York City has to offer should be accessible to everyone. We do have our faults, like I said, and we are working towards that. Next slide. So we've placed coordinators and disability service facilitators in these agencies across the city. Now, what does this do? Well, not only is it going to make our programs and services accessible, these individuals are part of what's happening in the fabric of things being built every day, like our Parks Department. Our Parks Department, I have to say, is probably, if not the most accessible park system in the country. We are building and designing and making sure kids with disabilities can move through the space, that things are put together where there's visual contrast and ramps that have a person with a disability to be part of. We have quiet areas for people with autism, and the list goes on, and we continue to do that. But that's all done in the capital design and making sure it's done. We do the same thing with our Department of Transportation and moving things forward. We are working with Department of Education to make sure that kids with disabilities are greatly involved, because we need to be able to transfer that child from middle school into high school and then into the workplace or into college where we can find meaningful jobs for them. Next slide, please. So I'm just at the end of our speech, and come march with us on July 10th. It's our second annual Disability Pride Parade. This is a great way for you to come out and say, hey, be part of everything that the city is doing. Get behind people with disabilities, because when you hire a person with a disability, you're going to get someone that is committed, attrition rate's going to be low, and you're going to get something that's diverse. Because people forget that the D in diversity is disability. And when I see things, and I see people posting things like wheelchair bound or differently abled, those things really say, hey, you need to be able to do something a little bit different. You need to kind of understand the disability community. You need to make sure that they're included in the process. And we hear a lot about gender, race, sexual orientation, but nobody remembers the D stand for disability. Because we know it's at work, it's what you can do that matters. Thank you.